The night I discovered my husband had emptied our children's college fund, I was standing in my kitchen at 11:43 p.m., still wearing my work badge, from a 14-hour shift, trying to remember if I had eaten anything since the granola bar I choked down in the parking garage at 7 that morning. I had not. I was 36 years old. I was a senior forensic auditor at a regional accounting firm that handled financial compliance for mid-sized corporations across the Mid-Atlantic. My job in plain language was to find money that people were trying to hide and to build the documentation that proved they had hidden it. I was exceptionally good at this work. I had a reputation in the industry for the kind of methodical, patient precision that made defense attorneys nervous and prosecutors grateful. I tell you this not to establish my credentials for what follows, but because it is important that you understand the specific quality of the silence that fell over my kitchen when I looked at my phone and saw the balance of our children's education account. It was the silence of a professional encountering something she had seen many times before in other people's lives. My name is Nora Calloway. This is the story of how I spent 2 weeks doing exactly what I do for a living, building a case, and how I chose Thanksgiving dinner at my in-laws' house, in front of 37 members of the Calloway extended family, as the moment to present my findings. First, let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus Calloway was 39 years old and had been in the 5 years since we married a man of extraordinary potential and minimal execution. He was charming in the specific way of people who have been told their entire lives that charm was sufficient. Warm, funny, quick, with a story able to make anyone in a room feel like the most interesting person there. He had an MBA from a university with a recognizable name. He had spent 3 years in corporate strategy at a major consulting firm before deciding 18 months into our marriage that the corporate world was fundamentally incompatible with his vision. His vision was a technology startup. The specific vision changed approximately every 4 months, but the underlying architecture remained consistent. Marcus would identify a problem, declare it a massive, underserved market, build a pitch deck using terminology borrowed from the most recent issue of a business magazine, and begin the process of seeking funding. This process reliably produced zero funding, after which Marcus would determine that the market wasn't ready, that investors lacked vision, and that the next idea was the real one. In 5 years of marriage, Marcus had launched 6 startups. None of them had generated revenue. 2 of them had generated invoices, which he had paid with our joint account, and which I had at the time believed were for legitimate business expenses. I now knew they were not. The specific startup that was current when I came home to find our education account emptied was called Proxima, and it was described in the pitch deck Marcus had left open on the desktop computer in our home office as a next-generation, AI-enabled peer-to-peer networking platform for conscious entrepreneurs. I had read this description twice when I had accidentally opened the file, looking for our insurance documents the previous month. I had not mentioned it to Marcus because I had learned through the accumulated experience of 5 years that questioning his business ideas produced lengthy conversations about vision and risk tolerance that I did not have the energy to sustain after a 12-hour workday. This was in retrospect a strategic error on my part. Marcus's mother was named Carolyn Calloway. She was 64 years old and operated with the serene, implacable authority of a woman who had decided somewhere around her 40th birthday that the world was organized according to her preferences and had never meaningfully revisited this assumption. She had raised Marcus with the specific conviction that he was exceptional, not in the statistical sense, but in the ontological one. He was exceptional because he was Marcus. This was simply true in the way that gravity was true, and people who disagreed were either envious or short-sighted. Carolyn had met me at Marcus's side at a charity dinner 6 years ago, and had from that first evening maintained toward me a consistent posture of warmth that contained somewhere in its foundation a fundamental indifference to my actual personhood. She was unfailingly pleasant to me. She remembered my birthday. She sent appropriate gifts when the children were born, But in all the years I had known her, she had never once asked me a genuine question about my work. And on the 3 occasions when I had mentioned a case I found interesting, she had redirected the conversation to something Marcus was doing within 2 exchanges. Marcus was their oldest. He had 2 siblings, a sister named Lauren, 34, who worked in nonprofit management, and who I genuinely liked, and a brother named Trevor, 37, who worked in commercial real estate, and who had the specific quality of a man who found other people slightly less interesting than his own opinions. Trevor had a wife named Dana, who was pleasant and watchful, and who had on 2 separate occasions over the years given me a look across a Callaway dinner table that I had interpreted as solidarity and had never had the opportunity to verify. The Callaway Thanksgiving was an institution. It happened every year at the family home in Chevy Chase, a large colonial that Marcus's parents had owned for 30 years. And it involved reliably between 30 and 40 people, a catered meal that Carolyn managed with the logistics precision of a military operation and a series of conversations that followed the grooves worn by years of repetition. Marcus's accomplishments were discussed. His potential was affirmed. The current startup was treated with the respectful interest that one extends to a promising young athlete. He's working hard, the breakthrough is coming, you just have to be patient. I had spent 5 Thanksgivings sitting at that table. This year I was going to do something different. I discovered the education account on a Wednesday night in early November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had come home late from a case that was in its final documentation phase, a medium-sized manufacturing company whose CFO had been routing vendor payments through a shell entity his brother-in-law had established in Delaware. I had been working the case for 3 months. The documentation was clean, thorough, and would hold up to scrutiny from anyone. I was, as I always was in the final stages of a case, simultaneously exhausted and precise. I made tea. I checked my phone. I opened the banking app to verify that the mortgage autopay had cleared because I had missed the notification that morning and wanted to confirm before I went to sleep. The mortgage had cleared. The joint checking account showed the expected balance reduced by the expected amount. I switched to the education accounts. We had 2. One for our daughter Maya, who was 7, and one for our son James, who was 5. I had established them the year Maya was born and had contributed to them consistently from my salary, modestly at first, then more substantially as my income grew. Marcus had contributed sporadically in the early years, and not at all in the past 2. The balance I expected to see in Maya's account was $47,000. I had last checked it 6 weeks earlier. The balance I saw was 0. James's account, also 0. I stood in my kitchen for approximately 30 seconds, looking at the 2 0 balances on my screen. Then I put the phone down, picked up my tea, and sat at the kitchen table. I did not panic. I did not call Marcus, who was in the home office, which I could tell from the light under the door, and the low murmur of what sounded like a video call. I sat with my tea, and I thought in the methodical way I thought about cases, about what the evidence meant and what I needed to do next. Both accounts were in my name, as the primary account holder, with Marcus listed as a secondary party with limited access. The investment firm that administered the accounts had a security protocol that required secondary parties to initiate a callback verification for withdrawals above a certain threshold. I knew this because I had set up the accounts and reviewed the security documentation when I did. This meant that Marcus had either called the firm and navigated the verification process, or he had used my login credentials to access the accounts online and circumvent it. I finished my tea. I went upstairs. I checked on the children who were asleep. I came back downstairs, went to the home office, and knocked on the door. Marcus was on a video call. He held up one finger without turning around, the universal signal for "I'm busy." Give me a minute, and I stood in the doorway and waited. The call ended. He spun in his chair and gave me the warm, distracted smile of a man who has been in his own world and is returning to yours. "Hey," he said, "you're home late. The Maya and James education accounts," I said. "The balances are showing 0, both of them." He looked at me. Something moved through his expression, not guilt exactly, not the sharp awareness of being caught, but something more complicated. The expression of a man who had prepared for a conversation and is calculating whether this is the moment to have it. "Right," he said. "I was going to talk to you about that." "Okay," I said. "Talk to me about it." He leaned back in his chair. "Proxima needs a capital injection to get to the next stage. I've been in conversations with some serious investors, people who aren't just kicking tires, they're genuinely interested. But they want to see that I have skin in the game, that I'm personally committed to the vision. They want co-investment. You took $87,000 from our children's education accounts," I said. "I reallocated it," he said. "Temporarily. Once we close the funding round, I'll put it back with the returns. We're talking potentially 3 to 4 times the original amount. Maya and James will have more for college than they would have had from a standard index fund." I looked at him. "How did you access the accounts?" I asked. A brief pause. "I found your login. It was in the Notes app on the iPad. The firm has a callback verification protocol for secondary party withdrawals above $10,000, I said. "Did you call them?" Another pause. "I called and explained I was your husband, and you were traveling. They walked me through an alternative verification process." I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said. "I'm going to bed." He looked slightly surprised by the absence of confrontation. "We can talk about this more if you want." "I know," I said. "Good night." I went to bed. I did not sleep. What I did in the 12 days between that conversation and Thanksgiving was what I always did when I encountered a financial irregularity that required investigation. I built a file. The first thing I needed to understand was where the money had gone. Marcus had told me it went to Proxima, but I had learned through professional experience that what people said money was for and what it was actually for were sometimes different things, and that the documentation was always more reliable than the explanation. I had access to our joint account. I had access to the credit card statements which I managed. What I needed was visibility into Marcus's business accounts, which were in his name alone. I had legitimate tools available to me that I had not previously deployed in my marriage because I had not previously had reason to. I was a forensic auditor with professional-grade financial investigation software and a network of contacts in banking compliance. I also had, as it turned out, Marcus's laptop password. He had given it to me 2 years ago, so I could book flights while he was in a meeting. And Marcus had not changed it since then. I want to be precise about the ethical dimension of what I did next, because precision matters in these things. I did not access any account that I was not legally entitled to access, or that did not relate to assets that were partly mine. What I found through the legitimate tools of my profession applied to information I was entitled to review. Proxima LLC was registered in Delaware. The registration listed Marcus as the sole member and manager. The registered agent was a formation service that handled thousands of LLCs. This was standard. The business bank account associated with Proxima had received 2 transfers in the past 6 weeks, $47,000 from Maya's education account and $40,000 from James's account. The 47 came first, then the 43 weeks apart. Marcus had presumably needed time to navigate the verification process for the second withdrawal, during which I had noticed nothing, because I had been in the final stages of the manufacturing case, and checking the education accounts was not part of my daily routine. Proxima's account had, as of the date I accessed the records, a balance of $12,000. The remaining $75,000 had been distributed. $22,000 had been paid to a vendor listed as Summit Design Partners for what the memo line described as brand strategy and visual identity development. I searched for Summit Design Partners in the state business registries. It was not registered in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, or D.C. It did not appear in any business directory I could access. It did not have a website. $18,000 had been paid to a company called Apex Consulting Group for strategic advisory services. Apex Consulting Group was registered in Nevada 18 months ago. The registered agent was the same formation service as Proxima. The sole officer was listed as Marcus Calloway. He had paid himself $18,000 from our children's college money for consulting services he had provided to himself. $15,000 had gone to what the statement described as conference and networking expenses. The transactions were a series of charges at hotels, restaurants, and what appeared to be a private members club in Washington, D.C. The remaining $20,000 had been transferred in 4 equal installments of $5,000 each to a personal account. The account number and routing information were available in the transfer records. I ran the account number through the tools available to me professionally. The account was in the name of Marcus Calloway. He had taken our children's education savings and paid it to himself, paid it to a non-existent vendor, paid it to a shell company he owned, and spent the rest on what appeared to be an extended period of expensive socializing. There was no investor. There was no funding round. There was no co-investment requirement. There was a man who had run out of ways to sustain his self-image and had found a new source of funding. I sat at my desk with the documentation spread in front of me, and I thought about what to do with what I had found. The obvious answer was to confront Marcus directly, present the evidence, and begin the process of legal separation and financial recovery. This was the efficient answer. It was also the answer that would allow Marcus and his mother to manage the narrative, to construct a version of events in which this was a misunderstanding, a temporary borrowing, a well-intentioned but poorly communicated business decision, to offer to make it right, to generate family pressure on me to be understanding, to remember the bigger picture, to not be so focused on the details. I had watched this dynamic operate for 5 years. I knew exactly how it worked. I chose a different approach. Thanksgiving was in 12 days. I need to tell you about my sister Priya. Priya Ramachandran was my older sister by 4 years, which made her 40, and she was the person in my life who combined 3 qualities I rarely found together. She was brilliant. She was ruthless when the situation required it, and she loved me without reservation or agenda. She was a corporate attorney who specialized in financial fraud litigation. We had grown up in the same house, been shaped by the same parents, and had arrived at adulthood with the same fundamental belief that the truth was the only foundation worth building on, and that people who preferred comfortable fictions to uncomfortable facts were going to encounter the facts eventually, regardless. I called her the morning after I completed the documentation. "I need your legal read on something," I said. "Tell me," she said. I told her. All of it. The education accounts, the transfers, the phantom vendor, the shell company, the personal transfers. When I finished, there was a brief silence. "How clean is your documentation?" she asked. "It's clean," I said. "How are you?" "I'm focused," I said. Another pause. "What do you want to do?" "I want to file for divorce," I said. "I want to recover the money, and I want to do it in a way that makes it impossible for the Calloway family to manage the story." "The Thanksgiving angle," she said, not a question. "You know the Calloway Thanksgiving," I said. "I attended it twice," she said. "I remember very clearly how Marcus was treated and how you were treated." 37 people, I said, including his parents, both siblings, the extended family, and the family attorney. The family attorney attends Thanksgiving. "He's been a close friend of Marcus's father for 30 years, I said. "He's always there." Priya was quiet for a moment. "You want the record to be established in front of witnesses who cannot later claim they didn't know. I want the Calloway family to understand what Marcus has done," I said, at the same time that they're welcoming him as the prodigal visionary who's about to have his breakthrough. I want there to be no private management of this information. I want it to be known clearly and simultaneously by the people who have spent 5 years telling me to be patient. "Nora," Priya said. "Yes." "I'm in," she said. "Tell me what you need." The 12 days were not passive. I engaged a family law attorney named Sandra Webb, who had been recommended to me by a colleague, and who, when I presented her with the documentation, described the situation with the specific professional precision I appreciated. "This is financial fraud within a marriage. The shell company payment alone constitutes self-dealing. The phantom vendor payment is potentially wire fraud. The misrepresentation to the investment firm to access accounts under your name is identity fraud. You have an exceptionally strong position. We filed no papers before Thanksgiving. This was deliberate. I wanted nothing served, nothing official, nothing that would put Marcus on alert before the dinner. Priya drove up from Richmond on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with my tea on the night of the discovery, and we went through the documentation together with the focused attention of two professionals reviewing a case file. The Apex Consulting payment is the clearest, she said, pointing to the bank statement. He paid himself $18,000 of your children's money for consulting services he provided to himself. There's no ambiguity there. It's self-dealing from a fund he didn't have the right to access. The Summit Design Partners payment is murkier, I said. No registered company, no documentation of services, but it could be argued he paid a freelancer who operates informally. Possible but unlikely given the amount and the timing, she said. $22,000 is not a cash-in-hand freelance payment. And it went out at the same time as the first education account withdrawal, which suggests he was distributing the money as quickly as possible once he had it. My read, too, I said. She looked at me. How are you holding it together? I'm treating it like a case, I said. It's easier that way. It's not just a case, she said. I know, I said. I'll deal with that part later. She accepted this because she knew me. The children, she said. They'll stay with me. The house is in my name. I purchased it before the marriage and kept it separate. Sandra has confirmed that Marcus has no ownership interest. I paused. I have been the primary earner for 3 of the 5 years of this marriage. I have paid the mortgage, the child care, and the majority of household expenses throughout. The case for primary custody is strong. Priya nodded. Thanksgiving, I said. We planned. Marcus was in good spirits the week before Thanksgiving. This was, I understood now, the specific good spirits of a man who believed he had successfully solved a problem. He had needed capital. He had found capital. The funding conversations he referenced were almost certainly fictional. But he believed, and this was the quality of his self-deception that I had taken years to fully understand. He believed in the fictional conversations the way some people believe in memories that have been shaped by repetition until they feel real. Marcus had told the story of Proxima's investor interest so many times to himself and to others that the story had acquired the weight of fact in his mind. He was affectionate with the children. He cooked dinner twice that week, which was unusual, and made a point of complimenting my work when I mentioned a project. He was in the specific way of people who have done something wrong and have managed to reframe it as righteous at peace. I watched him and felt the specific sadness of recognizing someone you once loved as someone you no longer know. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I waited until the children were in bed, and then I sat down with Marcus in the living room. He had a glass of wine. I had sparkling water. I've been thinking about the education accounts, I said. He looked at me with the careful expression of someone who has prepared for this conversation. I know it was a lot to process, he said. I should have talked to you before I made the transfers. I understand that. Yes, I said, you should have. But I genuinely believe this is going to work, Nora. The traction we're getting with Proxima is different from anything before. I can feel it. And when this funding closes, the first thing I'm going to do is put that money back, with interest. I looked at him. He was so certain. He had constructed the story so completely that he had moved into it and was living there. I hope the funding closes, I said. I hope it works out. He relaxed slightly. He reached over and put his hand on mine. Thank you for trusting me. I looked at his hand on mine. Of course, I said. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the specific combination of cold clarity and domestic chaos that I associated with every holiday involving young children. Maya wanted to wear her Halloween costume to the Callaway dinner. James had lost one of his good shoes. I managed both situations with the practiced efficiency of a working parent who has learned that some battles are worth choosing, and some are not. Maya wore the costume under a dress. James found the shoe under his bed. We drove to Chevy Chase in my car. Marcus drove separately. He had to pick up something for the dinner, he said, which I understood to mean he had promised his mother some contribution to the meal, and had forgotten about it until this morning and needed to stop at a store. I arrived at the Calloway house at 11:30. The house was already inhabited by the particular energy of a large family gathering that has reached critical mass, voices overlapping the smell of roasting turkey and cinnamon. Children running through the hallway, adults clustered in the kitchen and living room, in the groupings established by years of repetition. Carolyn was orchestrating from the kitchen with the serene efficiency she brought to everything. Marcus's father, Gerald, was in the living room with the family attorney, a man named Howard Birch, and Trevor, and two of Marcus's uncles. Lauren was in the dining room with Dana arranging the table. I handed my coat to the teenager who had been recruited for coat duty, took the children to say hello to their grandparents, and then carried the dessert I had brought to the kitchen. "Nora," Carolyn embraced me with her characteristic warmth. "You look exhausted, sweetheart. You work too hard." "It's been a busy season," I said. "Where's Marcus?" "He had to make a stop. He'll be here soon." Carolyn nodded with the fond indulgence she brought to every manifestation of Marcus's behavior. He was chronically late. He had always been chronically late. This was, in the Calloway cosmology, an expression of his creative temperament, rather than a failure of consideration. Lauren came in from the dining room and hugged me. "You look like you have something on your mind," she said quietly, because Lauren was perceptive in the way that middle children sometimes are. "I do," I said, "but it can wait until dinner." She gave me a look that was very similar to the look Dana gave me across tables. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said, "but it will be." Marcus arrived at 12:15, 45 minutes late, carrying a store-bought pie that he presented to his mother with the flourish of a man delivering something extraordinary. Carolyn received it with delight. Gerald clapped him on the shoulder. The assembled Calloways oriented toward him the way flowers orient toward light. He was the center. He was always the center, and the room adjusted itself accordingly. I watched from the kitchen doorway and felt the specific clarity of seeing something you have looked at many times and are finally looking at directly. Priya arrived at 12:30. She had driven separately as planned. She was impeccably dressed in the way she always was, not ostentatiously, but with the specific precision of someone who understood that presentation was information. She greeted the Calloways with the pleasant professionalism she brought to all social interactions, shook hands with Howard Birch, with the particular warmth of one legal professional acknowledging another, and found her way to my side in the kitchen. "Ready?" she said quietly. "Yes," I said. "The documentation is in your bag, and backed up to the cloud and emailed to Sandra," I said. Priya nodded. "After the meal. Before dessert." "Before dessert," I confirmed. We sat down to eat at 2:00. The Calloway Thanksgiving table was long enough to seat the full gathering, supplemented by 2 additional tables for the children. The adults ranged from Gerald's 81-year-old mother, who sat at the head, to Lauren's 9-year-old, who had negotiated successfully for a seat at the adult table. Howard Birch sat between Gerald and one of the uncles. Marcus was 3 seats from his father at the center of the table, where the light was best. I sat beside Priya across from Dana and Trevor, with a clear sightline to Marcus and to Carolyn at the far end. The meal proceeded as Calloway Thanksgivings always proceeded. Gerald gave a toast about family and gratitude that was sincere in its way. The food was excellent. The children required periodic management. The adults fell into their established conversational patterns. At some point in the main course, Trevor said something that had become, over the years, as reliable a feature of this meal as the turkey itself. He turned to Marcus and said, with the combination of genuine interest and competitive assessment that characterized their sibling dynamic, "So, Marcus, tell us about Proxima. Where are things?" The table oriented. This was the moment, the annual moment, when Marcus presented the current state of his vision to the assembled family and received their collective affirmation. Marcus set down his fork. He sat up slightly, the storyteller's posture. "Things are moving," he said. "Really moving. We're in serious conversations with 2 institutional investors, people who aren't just kicking tires. One of them is a fund that's made some of the defining investments in the Web3 space. When they come in, we're looking at a valuation that changes everything." Carolyn beamed. Gerald nodded with the pride of a man hearing confirmation of what he has always believed. Howard Birch looked interested. Trevor's expression contained the specific complexity of a man processing a sibling's success. "That's great news," Gerald said. "How much are they looking at?" "We're in the 8 to 10 million range for the Series A," Marcus said. "It's been a long road, but this is the one. I can feel it." I looked at my plate. Priya's hand found my arm under the table, a brief steady pressure. I waited until the table had moved past the funding conversation, waded through the second round of the turkey and the mashed potatoes, and the conversation about Gerald's golf game, and Carolyn's charity event, and Trevor's latest commercial property deal. I waited until the table had reached the comfortable, satisfied lull of a meal approaching its end. Then I said clearly, and without raising my voice, "I need to say something to everyone." The table shifted. Conversations paused. Faces turned toward me. Marcus looked at me with the expression of a man who has just noticed a change in the weather. "I'm sorry to do this at Thanksgiving," I said. "I've thought about the timing carefully, and I want to explain why I chose this moment. The Calloway family has been an important part of my life for 6 years. Many of you have been kind to me, and I believe that what I'm about to share is something that all of you are going to encounter in your own lives as this situation unfolds over the coming weeks. I would rather you hear it from me directly in one place at one time than encounter it in pieces through other channels." The table was very quiet. Maya had appeared in the doorway from the children's table, curious about the shift in adult energy. I made a brief gesture to Lauren, who quietly got up and guided my daughter back to the other room. 6 years ago, I said, I married Marcus because I believed in his intelligence, his potential, and his integrity. I have spent 5 years of our marriage as the primary earner for our family. I have paid the mortgage. I have paid the child care. I have managed the household finances while Marcus pursued a series of business ventures that have not generated revenue. I paused. I am not saying any of this to criticize Marcus's ambitions. I am saying it to establish context for what I need to tell you. Marcus had gone very still. His face had the quality of a man running rapid calculations. 3 weeks ago, I said, I discovered that the education savings accounts I had established for Maya and James, accounts that I had contributed to from my salary for 7 years, and which held a combined balance of $87,000, had been emptied. A sound moved through the table, not loud, the specific quiet sound of a group of people processing unexpected information. Marcus transferred those funds to his business account, I said. He did this by accessing my personal login credentials, and on at least one occasion calling the investment firm and misrepresenting himself as my authorized agent. I looked at Marcus. Is that accurate? Marcus had found his composure. He looked at me with the expression I had seen him deploy in difficult moments. Controlled, slightly wounded, the expression of a man being treated unfairly. Nora, this is not the place. I'm going to finish, I said pleasantly. Thank you. He stopped. I am a forensic auditor, I said, addressing the table. My professional expertise is tracing financial transactions and building evidentiary records. Over the past 2 weeks, I have applied those skills to understanding where our children's education savings went. I reached into the bag beside my chair and withdrew a set of folders, one for each major finding organized, and tabbed the way I organized every case file. I placed them in a neat row on the table in front of me. The first payment from Proxima's business account, I said, opening the first folder, was $22,000 to a company called Summit Design Partners for brand strategy services. Summit Design Partners does not exist. It is not registered in any state business registry. It has no website, no phone number, and no documented services. The payment was made to an account that I have not yet been able to trace to a named individual, but the absence of any legitimate business registration is significant. I slid the first folder to Howard Birch, who was sitting within reach. He took it with the instinctive response of a man whose professional training tells him to review a document when it's presented. The second payment, I said, opening the second folder, was $18,000 to Apex Consulting Group for strategic advisory services. Apex Consulting Group is registered in Nevada. It was formed 18 months ago. The sole officer is Marcus Calloway. A different kind of silence settled over the table. Marcus paid $18,000 of our children's education savings to a company he owns for advisory services he provided to himself, I said. I slid the second folder down the table toward Gerald, who received it with the expression of a man who has heard something he cannot immediately process. The third category, I said, is $15,000 in conference, networking, and entertainment expenses. Hotels, restaurants, a private members club. These may be legitimate business expenses. They may not be. I have the statements if anyone wants to review them. I opened the third folder and left it in front of me. The fourth and final category, I said, is $20,000 transferred in 4 equal installments to a personal bank account in Marcus's name. Not the business account, his personal account. The table absorbed this. I want to be clear about what the totality of this documentation shows, I said. $87,000 of savings that I accumulated over 7 years, specifically designated for my children's education, was transferred without my knowledge or consent to a business account. From that account, the money was distributed to a non-existent vendor, to a shell company Marcus owns, to personal entertainment expenses, and directly to Marcus's personal account. The business whose future was cited as the justification for these transfers. Proxima has generated no revenue in the time it has been operating. I looked at Marcus. The funding conversations you described at dinner, I said, the institutional investors, the Series A valuation. I would ask you in front of your family to provide documentation of those conversations, names, emails, term sheets, anything that verifies that the funding you described is real. Marcus looked at me. The performance of controlled wounded dignity had fractured. Underneath it was something raw, not guilt exactly, but the specific exposure of a man whose narrative has been removed from around him. Those conversations are confidential, he said. You can't ask me to. They're confidential, I said. Of course. I looked back at the table. I am not a lawyer. Priya is. I gestured toward my sister. She can speak to the legal dimensions better than I can. Priya looked around the table with the calm, professional demeanor she brought to courtroom presentations. What Nora has documented, Priya said, constitutes multiple potential causes of action. The unauthorized withdrawal from accounts in her name facilitated by misrepresentation to a financial institution is identity fraud. The payment to Apex Consulting, a company Marcus owns, constitutes self-dealing and potentially civil fraud. The payment to Summit Design Partners, a non-existent entity, is potentially wire fraud. The direct personal transfers are conversion of marital assets. She paused. Nora has retained a family law attorney and a forensic accountant. She will be filing for divorce this week. The financial fraud documentation has been preserved and will be part of those proceedings. The table was very, very quiet. Carolyn had not spoken. She was sitting at the far end of the table with her hands in her lap, and an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not the warm, managing composure she always maintained, but something more fragile and more honest. Gerald was still holding the second folder. He had opened it. He was looking at the Apex Consulting registration document. Howard Birch, the family attorney, had both folders in front of him and was reading with the focused attention of someone whose professional instincts have been activated. Trevor looked at Marcus with an expression that contained, I thought, the specific, complicated emotion of a sibling confronting the reality they had suspected and ignored. Lauren was looking at me. Dana was looking at her hands. Marcus pushed his chair back. "This is you're doing this at Thanksgiving, in front of my entire family. He stopped. He seemed to be looking for an accusation that would reframe what was happening. But the documentation was on the table, and the table had read it, and there was no reframe available. "I did it at Thanksgiving," I said, "because I have watched this family manage Marcus's narrative for 5 years. I have been told to be patient, to be supportive, to trust the vision. I have been the person in the background while Marcus was celebrated at the front. And when he needed money and had exhausted the legitimate options, he helped himself to our children's education savings without asking me." I paused. "I chose this moment because I wanted you all to understand what happened at the same time. I didn't want anyone to find out privately and have the opportunity to decide what to tell the others. I wanted the record to be established clearly in front of witnesses, without the possibility of a managed version reaching you first." Carolyn stood up from her chair at the far end of the table. She walked slowly toward us. The room watched her. She stopped beside Marcus's chair and looked at him. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Mom, did you take that money?" she asked. A long silence. "I was going to put it back," he said. "The funding." "Did you take it?" she said again. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a truth that can no longer be managed. "Yes," Marcus said. Carolyn closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked at me. "I'm sorry," she said. It was 2 words. They were not enough, but they were the most honest thing she had said to me in 6 years. "Thank you," I said. Howard Birch cleared his throat. He had set down the folders and was looking at Marcus with the expression of a man whose professional detachment is in tension with his personal loyalty. "Marcus," he said carefully, "I would strongly advise you not to say anything else until you've spoken with your own attorney." Marcus looked at the family attorney, then at his mother, then at his father, who had not said a word since I began speaking, and who was still holding the folder with the Apex Consulting registration. Gerald set the folder down on the table very carefully, as if it were fragile. "I need a minute," he said, and pushed back his chair. The rest of the afternoon had the specific quality of a structure that has sustained a foundational crack and is in the slow process of settling. Gerald went to his study and stayed there for 20 minutes. Carolyn returned to the kitchen, where Lauren and Dana quietly joined her. The extended family, the aunts, uncles, cousins, who had been present for the presentation, dispersed to the living room and the back porch, in the specific way of people who need to process something without making a scene. Trevor found me in the hallway. "I knew something was off," he said, "with the funding stories. The numbers he was throwing around in my business, we do the math. The numbers he described for Proxima never added up." He paused. I didn't say anything. "I know," I said. "I should have said something." "To me or to him?" I asked. He considered this. "Both, probably." "It wouldn't have helped," I said. "The money was already gone by the time I found out." Trevor was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" "I file on Monday," I said. "The children stay with me. The house is mine. It was mine before the marriage. Sandra will handle the financial fraud documentation as part of the divorce proceedings." I paused. "If Marcus is cooperative, and the money is recoverable through the Proxima accounts, Sandra believes we can avoid criminal charges. If he's not cooperative, or if the money has been dissipated in ways that aren't recoverable, the fraud documentation goes to the DA." Trevor nodded slowly. "And what do you need from us?" "From the family." I thought about this for a moment. "I need you not to lie for him," I said. "Not to yourselves, and not to anyone else. I need the story to be what it actually is, not a misunderstanding, not a well-intentioned business decision, not a temporary borrowing. What Marcus did was wrong. The documentation is clear. If that's what the family accepts and states when they're asked, that's what I need." Trevor held my gaze. "Okay," he said. Priya appeared at my elbow. "The kids are asking for you," she said. I followed her to where Maya and James were in the living room with Gerald's mother, who was 91 and had apparently missed the entire dramatic portion of the afternoon and was contentedly teaching them a card game. I sat down between my children and watched an old woman show a 7-year-old how to shuffle cards, and I felt something that was not triumph and not grief, but was somewhere in the complicated territory between them. The work was not finished. There was a great deal still to do. But the record was made in the room where it needed to be made, in front of the people who needed to hear it. My grandfather had believed that the truth was the only foundation worth building on. My sister had inherited the belief. I had built my career on it. Now I had built this on it, too. Whatever came next, it would be built on something real. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I filed for divorce. Sandra Webb's office was in Bethesda, on the 3rd floor of a building with large windows that looked out over a small park, where someone had planted an ambitious amount of ornamental grass that was in late November, the specific gray-brown of things that have been through something difficult and are waiting for spring. I sat across from Sandra with my folder on my lap, and the specific internal stillness I maintained when I was executing a plan that had been thoroughly considered and was now simply being carried out. "The documentation is excellent," Sandra said. She had said this before at our initial consultation, but she said it again now with the quality of someone who finds it worth repeating. "In 15 years of family law, I have rarely had a client walk in with this level of financial documentation already organized and sourced. It changes the calculus of the entire proceeding." "That's the job," I said. "Your job," she said. "Not everyone's job." She looked at the filing on her desk. "I want to walk you through the financial fraud angle again because it's going to be central. The Apex Consulting payment self-dealing from marital assets to a company he controls is the cleanest piece. Courts respond to that clearly. The Summit Design Partners payment is murkier, as you noted, but the absence of any registered entity receiving $22,000 is going to require explanation. He'll say it was a cash payment to a freelancer," I said. "He'll have difficulty producing any documentation of services received." "Which we will ask for," Sandra said, repeatedly and formally. She paused. "The personal account transfers are significant because they establish a pattern of intentional diversion rather than reckless business spending. If it were just the Summit Design payment, you could argue sloppiness. $20,000 transferred to his personal account in 4 installments is deliberate." "Yes," I said. "It is." "I want to discuss the criminal referral option," Sandra said. "You mentioned it at our initial meeting. Given the documentation, you have a referral to the DA's office is viable. Wire fraud, identity fraud, from the investment firm call potentially bank fraud, depending on how Summit Design Partners was paid. These are real charges that would be taken seriously." "I know," I said. "What's your current thinking?" I had been thinking about this since the night I completed the documentation. The answer had not changed. "I want the money back," I said. "I want the divorce. I want the children's education accounts restored. A criminal proceeding is slow, expensive, and uncertain. And it would be traumatic for Maya and James in ways that I am not willing to impose on them, if there's an alternative." I paused. "If Marcus cooperates, if the Proxima accounts can be audited, and the recoverable funds are returned, and if he signs an agreement that doesn't contest custody and supports reasonable financial terms, I will not make a criminal referral. But I want the cooperation agreement to be the first offer, not the last resort." Sandra nodded. "So the documentation exists as leverage." "The documentation exists as the truth," I said. "It's also leverage." She looked at me for a moment. "How do you want to approach Service Direct, or through the firm?" "Through the firm," I said. "I don't want to be present when he's served. I'll be at work." "All right." She made a note. "Give me 24 hours and he'll have the papers." I thanked her and went back to my office, where a new case was waiting. Marcus was served on Tuesday afternoon. I knew this because Sandra texted me at 3:47 p.m. with a single word, "Done." I was in a client meeting reviewing quarterly compliance reports. I read the text, put my phone face down on the conference table, and continued the meeting. Marcus called 6 times between 4 and 6 p.m. I did not answer any of them. At 6:15, he texted, "We need to talk. Please." I texted back, all communication through Sandra Webb's office. Her number is in the papers. He did not respond. I picked up the children from my neighbor Karen, who had been helping with pickup since the previous week, fed them dinner, helped Maya with her reading homework, supervised James's bath, and put them both to bed, with the specific focused attention of a parent who is redirecting everything available into the immediate and concrete. When both children were asleep, I went to the kitchen, made tea, and sat at the table. The situation was not clean. It was not resolved. It was in the precise way of things that are done correctly in motion, not settled, but moving in the right direction, on the right foundation. The filing was in. The documentation was preserved. The leverage was clear. What happened next depended on what Marcus did, and on what his family did, and on the decisions of people I could not fully control. This was, in my professional experience, the correct state of a case at this stage. I drank my tea. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in 3 weeks. Wednesday brought Marcus's mother. Carolyn called my cell phone at 8:30 a.m. after the children had left for school and before I had left for the office. I considered not answering. I answered. "Nora," she said. Her voice had the quality it had had Sunday evening when she'd said, "I'm sorry, something stripped of its usual management. I know you've asked for communication through attorneys. I'm asking you to make an exception for this call. Just this once." "I'm listening," I said. "Gerald and I spoke to Howard last night," she said, "for a long time. About the documentation you presented. About what Marcus told us afterward." A pause. "He confirmed it, all of it, including the Apex Consulting payment." I waited. "I want you to know that Gerald and I are not going to protect him from this," Carolyn said. "Whatever that cost us. And I know what it cost to say we are not going to lie for him or minimize what he did. You asked Trevor for that, and Trevor told me. We're extending the same commitment." "I appreciate that," I said. "I also want to tell you that Gerald and I have spoken to Howard about the Summit Design Partners payment." She paused. "We know who received that money. Howard is going to reach out to Sandra today. We believe it may facilitate the recovery of at least that portion of the funds." I sat with this for a moment. "Thank you," I said. "You don't have to thank me," Carolyn said. This is what we should have been doing. What we should have been willing to do." Another pause longer. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The children. Over the coming months. What do you need from us? Not from Marcus, from Gerald and me." I thought about this carefully, because it was the kind of question that deserved a careful answer. "I need you to be consistent," I said. "Not performatively, just reliable. If you say you'll be at a school event, I need you to be there. If you say you'll take the kids for a Saturday, I need that to happen." Marcus's unreliability has been a feature of our lives for 5 years, and the children have absorbed it. I need the people in their orbit to be the opposite of that. "We can do that," she said. "The other thing," I said, "is that I need you not to talk to Maya and James about any of this, in terms that put them in the middle. If they ask questions about why Daddy doesn't live with us anymore, or why things are different, redirect them to me or to the child therapist. I'm going to engage. Don't offer explanations that require them to understand adult failures. They're 7 and 5. "I understand," she said. "That's what I need," I said. A pause. "I know it doesn't undo anything, but I want you to know that I've been thinking since Sunday about the 5 years we've known each other, about the conversations we've had, or haven't had." Her voice shifted slightly. "I never asked you about your work, not once. I've been asking myself why that was." "You don't have to answer that question to me," I said. "I want to," she said. "I think the honest answer is that asking about your work meant taking it seriously. And if I took your work seriously, it required me to take seriously what it said about the balance of your marriage. And that was a complicated thing to take seriously given how I felt about Marcus. I listened to this. That was an important thing to say, I said. It's the truth, she said. That's the least I can offer. Howard Birch called Sandra at 11 that morning. Sandra called me at noon. The Summit Design Partners payment, Sandra said, was to a man named Craig Whitley. He's a marketing consultant. Marcus met at a networking event. He received the $22,000 in cash, a series of transfers, to his personal account. He apparently provided minimal actual services and understood when he received the money that the full amount wasn't going back to Marcus's wife. Understood in what sense? I asked. In the sense that Marcus told him the money was his own business capital and that he was restructuring some personal finances. Whitley accepted the explanation because it came with $22,000 attached to it. Sandra paused. He's not a sympathetic figure, but his culpability depends on how much he knew and whether he had reason to know the money was improperly obtained. Does he have the money? Howard believes most of it is still in his account. He spent some on what appears to be equipment purchases. He runs a photography side business. Sandra paused. Howard is going to be direct with Whitley's counsel. The position is that if Whitley cooperates with the documentation of what Marcus told him and returns the funds minus a reasonable good faith payment for whatever services he did provide, we don't pursue him. If he doesn't cooperate, we include him in the fraud documentation. That seems right, I said. What about the Proxima account, the $12,000 that was still there? Sandra has requested a formal accounting of all Proxima transactions as part of the divorce discovery. Marcus's attorney, he retained someone yesterday, a guy named Phil Harmon, who does mid-tier family law, has indicated they intend to contest the characterization of the Proxima expenditures as fraud. The position is going to be that they were legitimate business expenses. He's going to argue the Apex consulting payment was a legitimate expense, I said. That appears to be the plan, Sandra said, which is going to be an interesting argument to make about a payment to a company the payer controls. Courts have seen it before, I said. It's not unheard of in small business structures. The question is whether the payment had any business purpose and whether equivalent services could have been obtained on the open market for the same amount. Which is where your forensic expertise is going to be useful, Sandra said. Yes, I said. I want to prepare you for something, Sandra said. Harmon is likely to take an aggressive posture initially. It's his pattern. He comes in hard on the narrative, characterizes the opposing party as bad faith, unreasonable, financially sophisticated, in ways that imply manipulation. It's a tactic to create doubt about your motives. He's going to say, I engineered the Thanksgiving presentation for maximum damage, I said. Probably, Sandra said. And he'll suggest your documentation was gathered through inappropriate means. My documentation was gathered through my professional tools applied to information I had legitimate access to, I said. I've been through more depositions than I can count. The methodology is defensible. I know, Sandra said. I want you to be prepared for it emotionally as well as professionally. I thought about the kitchen on the night of the discovery. The 2 zero balances. The 30 seconds of standing still before I put the phone down. I've had 2 weeks to process this, I said. I'm ready. The 10 days following the filing were in the taxonomy of divorce proceedings, the specific period that practitioners called the initial turbulence phase, when both sides were establishing positions, attorneys were exchanging letters, and the parties were navigating the practical reality of a household that was separating. Marcus moved out on the Thursday after the filing. I had not asked him to leave immediately, but Sandra had indicated that given the financial fraud documentation, his position in the house was legally tenuous enough that his attorney would likely advise a voluntary departure before I filed a motion to remove him. This was apparently what happened. He packed 2 bags on Thursday afternoon while the children were at school and left for what I later learned was a hotel in Silver Spring. The house was different without him, quieter in some ways, louder in others. Maya noticed immediately and spent Thursday evening asking a series of questions that I answered with the careful honesty appropriate to a 7-year-old daddy and I were going to live in different houses for a while. It wasn't because of anything she or James had done. She could still call him. We both loved her very much. She received this information with a focused, slightly formal attentiveness she brought to things she found genuinely difficult to understand, and then asked if she could have cereal for dinner, which I took as a sign that she was processing and needed the comfort of the ordinary. James cried for 20 minutes and then fell asleep on the couch, watching a cartoon. He was 5. His architecture for grief was more direct and more efficient than his sister's, and I respected it. I engaged a child therapist named Dr. Ellen Park on Friday. Dr. Park came recommended by 2 different colleagues and had the specific quality I looked for in people I entrusted with important things. She asked more questions than she answered in our first conversation, and the questions she asked were the right ones. "What do the children know?" she asked. "That Daddy and I are going to live separately for a while," I said. "Not why. Not the financial dimension. That's appropriate for their ages," she said. "Children this age need safety and consistency more than they need explanation. Explanation comes later in pieces as they're ready to receive it." She paused. "How are you in functioning?" I said. "That's a professional answer," she said. "I'm a professional," I said. "It's the honest answer, too. I'm functioning. The grief is real, but it's not interfering with my capacity to do what needs to be done. I'll deal with the rest later." "Make sure later actually comes," she said. "I intend to," I said. Priya drove back up from Richmond on the first weekend of December. She arrived on a Friday evening with wine, a rotisserie chicken, and the specific no-nonsense warmth she brought to everything. We put the children to bed, and then sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen table that had become, over the past few weeks, the site of all the important conversations. And she poured the wine, and I told her where things stood. "Harmon came in with a letter," I said. "As Sandra expected. The position is that the Proxima expenditures were legitimate business expenses that I accessed financial records, without authorization using credentials, that weren't provided for that purpose. And that the Thanksgiving presentation was a deliberate act of bad faith designed to humiliate Marcus in front of his family." "The bad faith argument," Priya said. "Yes, the suggestion being that I orchestrated the timing for emotional damage rather than any legitimate purpose." "What's Sandra's response?" "That the timing was chosen to establish the facts before Marcus had the opportunity to create a managed alternative narrative, which is not bad faith, but is strategic, and that strategy is not prohibited in divorce proceedings." I paused. She's going to press back hard on the authorization question. My access to the joint accounts and the business records I reviewed was legitimate. The one piece that's genuinely arguable is the Proxima bank account, which I accessed through Marcus's laptop using credentials he had previously provided. Priya turned her wine glass slowly. "How did you access Proxima's account?" "Through his online banking portal. His laptop? His password, which he gave me for a specific purpose 2 years ago, and which he hadn't changed." I paused. "The legal question is whether his previous provision of the password constitutes ongoing authorization. Sandra thinks it's defensible, but not bulletproof. Harmon will push on it." "Harmon will push on everything," I said. "It's what he does." Priya was quiet for a moment. "What does Sandra think the realistic outcome looks like?" "Settlement," I said. "Most of these cases settle. The documentation is strong enough that taking it to trial is a significant risk for Marcus. The Apex consulting payment alone is going to require explanation that a judge will find difficult to accept. The question is what we can recover and what the terms look like. The education accounts. Full restoration is the baseline," I said. "Sandra won't accept less. The question is where the money comes from, whether Proxima has recoverable assets, whether Craig Whitley cooperates, whether Marcus has personal assets that can be directed toward the settlement." "Does he?" Priya asked. "He has a retirement account from his consulting years," I said. "He's been contributing minimally to it since he left the firm, but the base from his corporate years is substantial, approximately $300,000. I paused. "He also has a minority interest in a small piece of commercial real estate that his grandfather left him. Trevor told me about it a few years ago. I don't know the current value. Has Sandra identified those assets formally? They'll come up in discovery, I said. Yes. Priya looked at me. How much of the education money do you realistically expect to recover? I had thought about this carefully with the same methodical honesty I applied to every case. The Whitley payment, $22,000. I think most of that comes back, I said. The Apex Consulting, $18,000. That's in Marcus's personal account, which Sandra can trace through the divorce financial disclosure. The personal transfers, $20,000 same. The $15,000 in entertainment expenses is probably lost in the sense that it was spent, and there's no entity to claw it back from. I paused. So, realistically, $60,000 to $65,000 out of $87,000. Plus whatever the settlement terms include for prospective child support and any spousal support, which would offset the remaining gap over time. $65,000 out of $87,000, Priya said. Which means the children's accounts get substantially restored, I said. Not perfectly, not immediately, but substantially. I looked at my wine glass. I accepted a long time ago that nothing in this situation was going to be clean. The question is whether the foundation is real. I think it can be. Priya reached across the table and put her hand over mine. You know what I've been thinking about, she said. Since Sunday. Tell me. When we were growing up, Dad used to say whenever one of us was in trouble and trying to manage our way out of it, he used to say, tell the room. He meant say it out loud, in front of the people who need to know, because secrets take more energy to maintain than the truth does. And once the room knows, you can stop managing the secret and start dealing with the actual thing. I thought about our father, about the specific quality of his integrity, which had been the organizing principle of his life, and which he had communicated more through example than through instruction. Tell the room, I said. You told the room, Priya said. On Sunday at that table, you told the room. And now the room knows. And Marcus can't manage the narrative anymore. And the process can deal with the actual thing. She paused. That's what Dad would have done. He would have cried while he did it, I said. He was a crier. He absolutely was, Priya said. And for the first time in weeks, I laughed a real laugh. Not the controlled exhalation of managed composure, but an actual laugh at the memory of our father, weeping at a film about a dog, weeping at a news story, about a tornado, weeping at both of our college graduations. He would have been proud of you, Priya said. He would have cried about it, I said. Definitely, she said. We sat at the table for a long time after that, the way you sit with people you love, when the hard part is done, and the doing of it has created a specific intimacy that doesn't require filling. The December that followed was not easy, but it was moving. Sandra and Harmon exchanged letters. Harmon's initial posture was aggressive. As predicted, the bad faith framing the authorization question, the characterization of the documentation as gathered through improper means. Sandra's responses were measured and precise, as was her way. She did not match Harmon's heat. She simply continued presenting the facts. The Whitley matter resolved in the second week of December. Howard Birch, operating as an informal intermediary, rather than as anyone's attorney of record, facilitated a conversation between Marcus's world and Craig Whitley's. And the conclusion was, what Sandra had anticipated, Whitley cooperated, provided a written account of what Marcus had told him about the source of the funds, and agreed to return $19,000, the $22,000 less, $3,000 attributed to actual photography consulting services he had provided. The $3,000 reduction was, in Sandra's view, a reasonable concession to avoid the complexity of including Whitley in the fraud documentation. The $19,000 went into a holding account that Sandra established for the purpose. Discovery began in mid-December. Marcus's financial disclosure was to use Sandra's word sparse. He listed fewer assets than the documentation suggested he had, which was not unusual, but was noted and would be addressed. The retirement account appeared valued at $260,000 after the market movements of the previous quarter. The real estate interest did not appear. He's omitted the real estate. Sandra said when I came in for our weekly check-in. I know, I said. Trevor told me it was a parcel in western Maryland. Family property that Marcus's grandfather distributed to the grandchildren before he died. Marcus and Trevor and Lauren each have a 1/3 interest. I looked it up in this county property records. The three-way interest is valued at approximately $480,000 total. So Marcus's share is about $160,000. You found this through public records? Sandra asked. County Assessor's Database, I said. Publicly accessible. Sandra looked at me with the expression she had worn at our first meeting when I had walked in with the organized folders. You are exceptionally good at your job. Thank you, I said. What does it mean for the proceeding that he omitted it? It means his financial disclosure is incomplete, which is a problem for him, she said. We'll formally request supplementation. If he doesn't provide it voluntarily, we go to the court. Either way, it comes into the asset pool. She paused. His total disclosed and undisclosed asset base is more substantial than he's presenting. The retirement account, the real estate interest, whatever's left in the Proxima account, and whatever personal savings he has that we haven't identified yet. He had approximately $40,000 in a personal savings account as of 6 weeks ago, I said. When I reviewed the records, it was there. I don't know the current balance. Sandra looked at me. How did you know about the personal savings account? Joint tax return, I said. Interest income line. I've been doing our taxes myself for 3 years, and I track the income sources. The interest on that account was small but consistent. I found the account in the bank records when I was reviewing the Proxima transactions. The joint tax return gives you legitimate access to the interest income information, Sandra said. The bank record is trickier. It's the same bank as our joint account, I said. The statement came to the house. I opened it. Sandra considered this. It came to the joint address and you opened it. Yes. All right, she said. That's defensible. It was mailed to a shared address. And you were a resident with a reasonable expectation of access to mail delivered there. She made a note. $40,000 in a personal savings account, plus the retirement account, plus the real estate interest. His actual asset picture is significantly different from what he's disclosed. Yes, I said. He made a mistake, Sandra said. People in financial fraud situations often do. They manage the immediate crisis, and then they manage the subsequent crisis, and they lose track of what the other party actually knows. She looked at me. You've been building this file from the beginning. It's the job, I said. I don't know how to do it any other way. Christmas was complicated. The children spent Christmas Eve with me and Christmas Day with Marcus, which was the arrangement Sandra had proposed as a temporary schedule pending the formal custody agreement. I had agreed to it because I had thought carefully about what Maya and James needed from their father, whatever had happened between us. And the answer was not nothing. They needed him to be reliable. Whether he could be was not something I could control. But removing access was not the right response to the risk of his unreliability that would have compounded one harm with another. Marcus came to the house on Christmas morning to pick them up. He rang the bell rather than using his key, which he had returned the previous week. I opened the door. He looked tired in the specific way of people who have stopped constructing a persona and don't yet know how to occupy the space without one. His hair was slightly less styled than usual. He was wearing a jacket I recognized from early in our marriage, before the designer period. They're ready, I said. Maya has a list of things she wants to show you. James is excited about the Lego set. Okay, he said. A pause. Nora, he said. Through Sandra, I said not unkindly. Not about the case, he said. I wanted to say I know what I did. Not the business framing, not the temporary reallocation story. What I actually did. He paused. I took money that wasn't mine to take from accounts that were for my children because it was available and I needed it, and I told myself a story about it that made it feel acceptable, and it wasn't. He stopped. I'm not asking you to accept that as an apology. I know it isn't one the way it needs to be. I'm just saying it clearly so you know I understand it. I looked at him. I hear you, I said. That's not forgiveness, he said. No, I said. It's not. The children appeared behind me in the doorway, coats on and bags in hand, and the adult conversation dissolved into the immediate and concrete demands of two children excited about Christmas Day. I watched them leave with their father. I stood in the doorway until the car turned the corner. Then I went back inside and called Priya, who was spending Christmas with her in-laws in Richmond, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing important. Family stories, a book she'd been reading, a trip she was planning for the spring. The conversation had the specific texture of something restorative, of putting down the weight for a while, and simply being a person rather than a party to a proceeding. After we hung up, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of a house without children, and I let myself feel the specific grief that had been waiting its turn behind the documentation and the strategy and the proceedings. It was real grief, not for Marcus, or not primarily for Marcus. I had been grieving the end of that marriage for longer than I had understood in the gradual, unacknowledged way that people grieve things they haven't yet admitted are ending. What I was grieving was simpler and more foundational, the version of my life I had believed I was building, the partner, the shared future, the idea that the people you chose would choose you back with equal seriousness. I sat with it for a while. I didn't rush it. Then I washed the coffee cup and went for a walk in the December cold, through the neighborhood, where the Callaway house was not far enough that I couldn't see it if I walked in that direction, and I walked in the opposite direction, through the streets I had chosen for myself, and I let the cold air do what cold air does, which is make everything very clear. The settlement negotiations opened formally in January. Harmon had in the intervening weeks moderated his initial aggressive posture. This was, Sandra explained, a common trajectory. Attorneys came in hard to establish leverage, and then reality, in the form of the actual documentation, asserted itself, and positions adjusted. Marcus's actual asset picture, once Sandra's supplementation requests had forced the real estate disclosure and the personal savings account into the proceeding, was substantially more than he had initially presented. This changed the calculus. He's looking at a case where he can't reasonably contest the Apex consulting payment, Sandra said at our January check-in. The self-dealing argument is too clean. And with the real estate asset now on the table, his position is weaker than he thought. Harmon is going to want to settle because the risk of trial given the documentation is too high. What's the opening position? I asked. We're asking for full restoration of the education accounts, $87,000 funded, through a combination of the Whitley recovery, the Proxima account balance, and a direct payment from Marcus's retirement account. We're asking for primary physical custody with liberal visitation and child support calculated on his actual earning capacity rather than his current income. She paused. The earning capacity piece is important. Marcus hasn't worked in 4 years. His MBA and his consulting background give him an earning capacity that's significantly higher than zero. Courts have discretion to impute income based on earning capacity rather than actual income, particularly when the disparity between capacity and actual income appears intentional. He'll argue Proxima constitutes employment, I said. Yes, Sandra said. We'll argue Proxima has generated no revenue in its operating period and constitutes no viable basis for income imputation. She paused. On spousal support, I want your thoughts. You have significantly higher income than he does. In a standard analysis, that creates potential exposure for spousal support payments. I had thought about this. I'm willing to discuss a time-limited support arrangement, I said, not indefinite. If Marcus is genuinely capable of earning, and I believe he is, he's intelligent, and he has real skills, then an indefinite support obligation doesn't incentivize the behavior we want. A time-limited arrangement with a defined end date gives him a bridge while he rebuilds an employment profile. That's a generous position given the circumstances, Sandra said. It's a practical position, I said. I want the children to have a father who is employed and functional. A support arrangement that extends indefinitely creates a structure where he doesn't have to be. I paused. 2 years. At a reasonable amount. with a condition that it terminates if he secures employment equivalent to his earning capacity. Sandra made a note. All right. That's actually a constructive offer that Harmon may respond to better than you'd expect. It frames you as reasonable rather than punitive. I'm not trying to be punitive, I said. I'm trying to get to a real outcome. Harmon's response came in the second week of January. It was, as Sandra had predicted, substantially more moderate than the initial letter. The narrative had shifted. Marcus was no longer portrayed as a visionary entrepreneur whose assets had been improperly scrutinized. He was now a man who had made a serious mistake and wanted to reach a fair resolution. The counteroffer was $65,000 toward the education account's joint physical custody rather than primary, and a 2-year support arrangement at a higher monthly figure than I had proposed. We countered. This was the part of the process that required patience rather than precision, the iterative movement toward a number that both parties could accept without feeling that the result was unjust. I had observed this process from the outside many times in the financial fraud cases, where civil settlements preceded or followed criminal proceedings. The negotiation itself was a form of reality testing. It revealed what each party was actually willing to accept when the opening positions were removed. What Marcus was willing to accept, it turned out, was considerably more than Harmon's initial letter had suggested. By the end of January, we had the outline of an agreement. $87,000 toward the education accounts, the full restoration I had asked for, funded through the Whitley recovery, the remaining Proxima balance, and a directed distribution from Marcus's retirement account. Sandra had been right that the retirement account would be accessible. The court had discretion to direct retirement funds as part of equitable distribution, particularly when those funds were the primary recoverable asset. Primary physical custody, with Marcus having the children every other weekend and one weeknight. I had asked for this and received it, though I had accepted that the arrangement would be revisited in 18 months when the children were older and Marcus's situation was more stable. Child support calculated on imputed income of $60,000 annually, a number that represented Marcus's realistic entry-level earning capacity, given his background, substantially below what he had earned at the consulting firm, but also substantially above zero. He had negotiated this down from Sandra's initial imputed figure. I accepted it because it was still real money, and because the alternative was litigation over the imputation methodology that would cost more than the difference. The support arrangement 18 months rather than 2 years, at a figure that represented genuine compromise. The termination condition I had proposed was included. It ended if Marcus secured employment at or above the imputed income figure. The real estate interest, Marcus's share, would be maintained in the existing structure and treated as a future asset, with the provision that if the property was ever sold, or if Marcus liquidated his interest, a portion would be directed to a supplementary education account for the children. This was Sandra's language, and I thought it was elegant. It didn't require immediate liquidation, which would have triggered family complications with Trevor and Lauren, but it preserved the children's claim on the asset. When Sandra walked me through the final terms, she said, "This is a good outcome. Given where we started with $87,000 gone, and no formal proceedings underway, this recovers the money, establishes the custody structure you wanted, and creates financial accountability going forward. I've seen better outcomes, but not often, and not when the starting point was this damaged." "The documentation helped," I said. "The documentation was decisive," she said. "Without it, Harmon would have run the misunderstanding narrative for months. The documentation foreclosed that." She paused. "You built a very clean case." "Thank you," I said. "It's what I do." The settlement was signed on the 14th of February, which was not a date I had chosen deliberately, and which I did not find ironic in any painful way. It was a date in February, and papers were ready to be signed, and so we signed them. The marriage was over, the proceedings were concluded, the record was made, and the terms were set, and the process that had begun on a Wednesday night in early November, when I had seen 2 zero balances on a banking app, was in its official dimension complete. I told the children that evening. Not the financial specifics, they were 7 and 5, but the clearer version of what they had already understood was happening. Daddy and I were going to live in different houses permanently. They would see Daddy every other weekend and on Wednesday evenings. Both houses were their houses. Both parents loved them completely. Maya asked if it was because Daddy had done something wrong. I had thought about how to answer this question and had talked it through with Dr. Park. Daddy made some choices that weren't fair to our family, I said. And when that happened, I had to make some choices too. The choices I made were the ones I thought were right. I paused. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that change things, even when everyone still loves each other. Maya considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to difficult information. Do you still love Daddy? She asked. I love Daddy in the way you always love someone who was important to you, I said. But sometimes love isn't enough to keep a family in the same house. That's a complicated thing that's hard to explain when you're 7. I'll understand it better when I'm older, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I said. You will. James had fallen asleep during this conversation, which was exactly the kind of efficient processing I had come to rely on from him. I carried him to bed, tucked him in, and stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, in the specific way you stand in the doorway of a sleeping child's room, looking at the fact of him, at the simple and enormous fact of his existence, which was the most real thing in my life, and which could not be reduced to documentation or positioned in a proceeding, or managed into a form that was easier to carry. He was sleeping with his arms thrown above his head, in the way he always slept, in the way he had slept since he was a baby. He was 5 years old, and he was mine. And whatever had happened, and whatever would happen next, this was the part that was true. Spring came slowly to the neighborhood that year, the way spring sometimes does, tentative at first. A week of warmth, followed by a cold snap, the trees starting and stopping, the light changing incrementally until one morning in late March, you looked out the window and realized that something had shifted, and you weren't entirely sure when. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning when I was getting ready for work, and Maya was looking out her bedroom window and said without turning around, "The tree in Mrs. Henderson's yard has leaves." "So it does," I said. "I like it when the leaves come back." She said. "Me too," I said. She turned around. "Mom," she said, "are you happy?" I looked at my 7-year-old daughter in her school clothes, with her hair in the slightly lopsided ponytail she had learned to do herself and was very proud of. "I'm working on it," I said. "Are you?" She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "I think so," she said. "I missed Daddy on the weekend, but I was glad to come home." "You can miss him and be glad to be here," I said. "Both things can be true." She nodded, apparently satisfied with this formulation, and went to get her backpack. The education accounts were fully restored in the first week of April. The Whitley recovery cleared first $19,000 into the holding account. Then the Proxima balance, $11,000, after the accounting firm Sandra had retained, completed the formal audit. Then the directed retirement distribution, $57,000, the difference which took until April. Because retirement account distributions required specific documentation and specific timelines, even under court order. On the Thursday in April, when the final transfer cleared and Sandra texted me the confirmation I was at my desk at work, reviewing the preliminary documentation on a new case, a regional hospital network whose accounts payable department had a pattern of vendor payments that didn't hold up to scrutiny. Standard work, the kind of case I handled every month. I read the text. I put the phone down. I looked at the preliminary documentation for another 30 seconds. Then I picked the phone back up and called Priya. "It's restored," I said. A pause. "Then all of it, I said. Both accounts. Back to where they were, plus the interest that would have accrued." Another pause. Longer. "Dad would have cried," she said. "He absolutely would have," I said. "Are you crying?" "I'm at work," I said. "Nora." "A little bit," I said. She laughed. I laughed. We stayed on the phone for a few minutes, not saying much, in the specific companionable quiet of people who have been through something difficult together and are on the other side of it. In May, I attended Maya's school spring concert. It was held in the school gymnasium, which had been decorated with construction paper flowers and hand-lettered programs, and the specific joyful clutter of an event organized by a teacher who loves children more than aesthetics. The second grade class performed 3 songs, accompanied by a piano that was slightly out of tune, in a way that somehow made it more, rather than less affecting. Maya was in the second row. She had been practicing for 3 weeks. She had informed me very seriously that she was going to look directly at the audience during the performance, and not at the teacher, because that was what professional singers did, and she intended to be professional. She was professional. She looked directly at the audience, located me in the 4th row, and gave me a small private nod, a 7-year-old's version of an acknowledgement between colleagues. Marcus was there. He had arrived on time, which I noted. He sat 2 rows behind me with his mother and Gerald, who had made a point of attending. We nodded to each other when I arrived. It was a civil nod, not warm, not cold, the nod of 2 people who have arrived at a workable form of coexistence. After the concert, when the children had been released to their parents, and Maya was explaining to Gerald in great detail why she had chosen the 2nd row rather than the 1st, Carolyn appeared beside me. "She was wonderful," Carolyn said. "She worked hard for it," I said. Carolyn looked at her granddaughter, who was now demonstrating to James the correct posture for professional singing. "How are you?" Carolyn asked. It was the genuine question, not the social one. "Better," I said. "Actually better." "Good," she said. And then, quietly, "I've been doing some thinking about the questions I didn't ask you over the years. About your work." She paused. "I'd like to hear about it sometime. Not to make up for anything I know you can't make up for, things you can only do things differently going forward, but because I genuinely want to know." I looked at Carolyn Calloway, a woman I had known for 6 years, and had never fully known who had caused harm through the specific texture of her inattention, who was standing in a school gymnasium in May, asking to hear about the work she had spent years ignoring. "I'm free next Saturday afternoon," I said. "If you want to have coffee." She looked at me. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." There is something I want to say about the shape of what happened, because the shape matters. This was not a story about revenge. I want to say that plainly and mean it precisely. Revenge is organized around the satisfaction of watching someone suffer for what they've done. That satisfaction was not what I was looking for, and it was not what I found. What I was looking for was the truth on the record, the money back in my children's accounts, and the foundation of my life made real rather than assumed. Those things required action, and the action I took was organized around the specific skills I had built through years of honest, methodical work. I built a file. I told the room. I executed a plan. The outcome was not clean. Marcus is still. Marcus, he is working now at an entry-level analytics position at a consulting firm that agreed to take a chance on him. And whether this represents genuine change or a new chapter of the same story is not something I can know yet. The 18-month support arrangement will expire this fall. The children are navigating a situation that is genuinely hard for children in the resilient and heartbreaking way that children navigate hard things. There are good weeks and difficult ones. The school concerts are good. The Wednesday evening pickups are sometimes difficult. We manage. The education accounts are full. I check them every month because I check everything every month. It's the job. It's the habit. It's the way I am. And every month, the balances are what they should be. Growing at the rate they should grow, tracking toward the futures I intended them to fund. Maya, who is now 8, has decided that she wants to be either a scientist or a judge. She has not narrowed it down. When I asked her how she would decide, she said, with the focused seriousness she brings to everything, "I want to figure out what's true. Which one lets you do that better?" I told her I thought both had their merits. She told me she would continue her research. I told her that sounded like the right approach. On a Thursday evening in June, I was at the kitchen table with a case file when James came downstairs in his pajamas, having negotiated a departure from bedtime, on the grounds that he needed water, which he had already obtained and was holding. So the grounds were satisfied, and yet he was still standing in the doorway. "Mom," he said. "Yes." "Is everything okay now?" I looked at my 6-year-old son. He was holding his water glass with both hands, in the careful way he held fragile things. "It's getting there," I said. "What does getting there mean?" "It means we're not where we were," I said, "and we're not all the way where we're going. We're somewhere in the middle, moving in the right direction." He thought about this. "Are we moving fast or slow?" he asked. "At the right pace," I said. He considered this answer, apparently decided it was sufficient, and came to the table and put his head briefly against my arm. In the direct, uncomplicated way, he showed affection, and then took his water glass and went back upstairs. I sat at the table with the case file and the June evening light coming through the window and the specific quiet of a house where 2 children are upstairs and the work is in front of you and the foundation under you is real. The case file was a regional construction company whose project accounting had a pattern I had seen before. Small discrepancies at the line item level that accumulated into something significant when you map them across 18 months of reports. Someone was being careful. Someone had been careful for a long time. But careful isn't the same as invisible, and I knew what I was looking at, and I knew what to do. I opened the first tab. I began to build the file.